I got involved with the film because I really was a fan of Mathieu Kassovitz, and I had seen another movie of his, Métis. At the time, I had a company, Egg Pictures, and I found him. I was so enamored with him. I thought he was so talented. I said, "Find out what this guy's doing, and let's see if we can get him in to do something." And we started talking about something. And he said, "Well, I just have to tell you, I just finished a movie, and it's gonna be shown at Cannes, and you might want to see that movie before you consider me." So I got to see La Haine. And I was just completely blown away. Not only had Mathieu moved on to an unanticipated level of expertise as a director, but there is a real soul to that film that's about France, how it is now. Something that Americans certainly don't know, but a lot of French people didn't know either. And it really gave rise to sociopolitical issues with the voice of the people in some ways, the voice of that community, of that town, of the banlieue. I probably had a little inkling of what was going on in France because I have family there and I've been going to France for many years. I had nephews and nieces, of course, who were young and, listened to that music. And there was something that had been creeping in just sort of about American culture and its effects on European culture and how European culture was changing. But I had never really seen it in its entirety, and I had never seen it done so coherently, with such an interesting voice. Here was a film that was really trying to talk about violence. The setup is that these boys who have nothing to do all day because they don't have jobs and they sit around pretty much and talk all day have found a gun. And when these kids find this gun and it brings them into a different side of that culture, and the journey to take this gun, to try and figure out what to do with it, takes them to all these places and takes them to meet these people and brings them into violent situations, it brings them into friendships, it takes them to Paris where they've never been before. It's an odyssey in some ways. It's a road movie, right? You're given a piece of information in the beginning of the movie and the three characters have to go on this journey, and they go on this journey together and they travel to, in tragic vocabulary, through a forest of experience, and they change. It's that experience of learning about other cultures, learning about other people, and then having that reflect on themselves and who they're becoming and who they're not becoming, what they hate about themselves and what they like about themselves. That reflection in some ways changes them as human beings. This was a very particular point of view, a very interesting moral point of view.
Ça va, grand-papa? Il n'y a pas mort d'homme? Il y a mort d'homme? Il n'y a pas mort d'homme? Donc tout va bien. Tout va bien.
Alors, s'il te plaît.
S'il te plaît. C'est bon, on se casse. On se casse! On se casse.
S'il te plaît. S'il te plaît.
Mathieu lives on both sides. He's a neighborhood guy in some ways, out in Belleville, and he knows those people, and he's a part of a diverse culture. But he's also pretty well educated, and he's lived in an intellectual place, and he's read a lot of books, and he sees the other side as well. The beauty of Mathieu is that he's a real filmmaker, and his interest is in the emotions of the characters. His interest is in the awakenings of the characters. Vince, or Vincent Cassel, Saïd and Hubert, they have different colored skin. One's a Jewish guy, one's from Africa, from Black Africa, and one is a North African of descent. Of course, they're all French. They're all born and raised in France. They're friends. They're a subset family because in some ways they've been disenfranchised and marginalized by the culture. The culture sort of gives you a mixed message, which is we'll take care of you, but we won't give you a future. And that's really been the problem in the banlieue. There's not a lot of purpose and not a lot of future for them. And because they're not integrated into the culture, because they're considered immigrants, and so not a part of French culture in some ways, that's an old French bias, they're sort of lost in this limbo land. You see their situation, that they are, they're good friends, and that they're just lost in some ways. There's nothing for them to look forward to, that there's no future for them, and they're looking for some power, and that there's no power in their lives, and that they're searching for some kind of meaning.
'Cause we may never pass this way again.
The performances in the movie are so beautiful. Hubert Koundé has such gravity to him. He has a real leading man quality to him, and yet a sweetness that I love, that he was able to get. He's the one that you'd trust in some ways to get you through the experience, and yet at the same time, he's really quite babyish and kind of naive, romantic even. Vincent Cassel, of course, has gone on to do wonderful things and has been in so many movies. It's a revelatory performance for him. I mean, I saw the guy in this movie and said, who's that guy? Follow that guy. He's just an amazing actor. It's a wonderful performance from him, filled with humor and filled with such rich language from him.
Putain, je te dis, à New York, ils ont tous cette coupe-là, ok? C'est la coupe qui tue, ça. Alors t'arrêtes de béflant et tu me fais confiance.
New York?
Ouais.
Mais de quel New York tu parles? C'est ça la mode à New York? Tu te fous de ma gueule ou quoi? On dirait un punk! Rigole pas!
Vas-y, fais-moi un bisou, allez. Allez, vas-y, Saïd, bouge.
So Saeed, you know, sort of the third wheel sidekick. In some ways, you know, he represents so much because he's North African culture. And North African culture in France is a big deal. It's very strong, and it's the most present of all of the immigrant populations, and the one that has the most socio-political unrest and the most interesting, in some ways, the most interesting history. And anyways, they're all wonderful in the film, and it's a great ensemble with the three of them and how they work together.
Mais non, c'est le cake de Mohamed, ça. Il vient de changer le pot.
Mais non, ça c'est la merde de Vince en YZ.
Lequel, Mohamed, là? Celui, le petit frère de Farida, là?
Farida, celle qui vient de passer son permis là?
Non, Farida, celle qui travaille au marché, là. What?
One of the reasons why the three actors work so well and why they blend so well with all of the other non-actors that he found, that Mathieu found, is that Mathieu's an actor. So he has a real sense of pacing, he has a sense of timing, he has a real sense of the language and the music of acting, and he was, I think, most fascinated by that. And it's a wonderful combination that he's such a technical director who has such a big style and yet is so interested in the personal part of acting. The improvisational quality of the performances are quite well written, so they aren't all improvised. There are sections where a character will go off. There's a young man who goes off and is trying to tell the story of a TV show, and he goes on and on and on, and he never ends, and he just keeps going and going and going and going, and you realize he's going to sit there all day and talk about a TV show, because that's what you do when you don't have a job and you have no place to be. And the other character looks at him, and he gets to the end of this thing, and it's very colloquial, of course, very, very rich language, and he gets to the end of this thing, and he goes, yeah, and then what? And so what? And the kid goes, that was it. There was no point, you know. The pointlessness of their lives in some ways has such humor to it. Another scene that I like a lot where they go into a bathroom somewhere in Paris, and there's a guy going to the bathroom, an old man going to the bathroom, and he starts telling them the story of his life, and he goes on and on and on, and the story is dark. It's about how his family was killed and how, in some ways, you know, what happened during the Holocaust, and these kids, for the first time, get this sense that life is dramatic and that life is tragic, and there are horrors that preceded them, and a sense of their ancestry in some ways, and the movie just kind of stops for that moment, and just allows the characters to experience what, you know, this performance from these other characters.
Et alors après qu'est-ce qui s'est passé?
Rien. Grunwaldski est mort de froid. Au revoir. Au revoir. Au revoir.
Pourquoi il nous a raconté ça?
Mathieu takes a lot from American movies. He said, that's what I grew up with. And my references are not like, you know, Tarkovsky or, you know, Renoir or whatever. My references are Steven Spielberg, and they're Spike Lee, and they're Martin Scorsese. That's what I grew up in. Those were the movies that moved me, and those were the movies that made me want to be a filmmaker because they felt true to my experience. There are lots of references in the movie to Taxi Driver, for example. You know, one of the first shots you see of Vincent Cassel is him doing the famous Robert De Niro. Are you talking to me? Doing it to the mirror and, you know, putting a mean face on and trying to look like Robert De Niro in French, which is hilarious.
Oh, 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 c'est à moi que tu parles. Mec, c'est à moi qui parle, son cul. C'est à moi qui parle, putain. C'est à moi que tu parles comme ça, mec.
He does, those wonderful Spike Lee tracking shots where you move in on the character very, very fast until you finally get to a close-up, and the character's face is right in the middle of the frame, right where the crosshairs are, with the wide-angle lenses. He uses all of them. He has references, but it is a cohesive piece. It's not a movie that's an imitation of other films. It has its own style and its own look. The black and white is so spectacularly beautiful, and it is brave. Of course, it limits your release. And there was a lot that was brave about how he made the movie. He didn't make the movie with any French subventions. He really wasn't able to get much money from the government, which almost every French movie gets money from the government, because it wasn't a topic anybody was wild about. So there was a lot that was unpopular about the film going in. And clearly the black and white would not have put him in a big popularity contest, but he felt that it was important for the film, and you look at the movie and it has a classic quality to it. You don't say, oh, here's a movie that's about now and in 2 years it won't be true. Here's a movie that's really a classic film in the vein of Raging Bull. Here's a movie that, even though these are people that you may consider insignificant, that you may consider marginalized, these lives are significant, and there's something quite tragic about the story, but not entirely gritty, because that world is not entirely gritty. It's not a movie that's all about poverty. It's a movie that's about, in some ways, people that don't know their meaning and don't have their purpose in life. And so there's a beauty to it as well.
Et moi, je suis encore qui je suis, d'où je viens.
Ouais, bah, retourne-y, connard, ferme ta gueule.
Ouais, va niquer ta mère, toi.
Mathieu does a combination of two really interesting shots in the movie. He does these shots that are very composed. You'll have three characters, for example, sitting on a ledge with these very graphic buildings behind them, and they're all sharp in the frame, and they're composed in very. It reminds me of maybe Kertész or other French photographers, very staid and static, because these are people who aren't going anywhere. They're going to be sitting in that same place tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And it's juxtaposed with these great shots of movement that are not motivated by anything. It's not because a train went by that we have these very fast, dolly shots on the character. It's because their lives are about to change. I think specifically of the moment that Vince takes out the gun. You have a series of very, very, very kinetic angles that have this strength and power to it. The rest of the shots in some ways have been quite static. And suddenly, because of the presence of this gun, which is lit spectacularly beautifully, the power of that implement, the power of the steel, is going to bring movement into their lives, and is going to change them, and is going to bring power to them. It's an eye-opening experience for them, because they've been kind of protected and sheltered. And when these kids find this gun and it brings them into a different side of that culture, the clashes with the police, with the detectives, with drug dealers, etc. All of that stuff is so fascinating, and has mushroomed and turned into something so interesting in the 12 years since La Haine came out. There is so much in the movie that was so prescient, sociopolitically, and I'm so proud of him for that. That he knew his culture well enough that he knew what was coming. The riots in the beginning of the movie, the kids feeling disenfranchised and lashing out and expressing themselves in ways that they don't even understand. All of that came to pass in France in the last 2 years, and it has shaken Europe to its core, not just in France, but in Germany, in Italy, and it has spread. It was really an honor to try and help Mathieu figure out how to bring this beautiful piece of art to America so that people could love it for all the reasons that I loved it. Because it's half of my culture in some ways, The French language and the amount of time that I spent in France is half of who I am. I always say, we made quite a few movies at Egg Pictures, but I always say this movie is the one I'm the most proud of because I had nothing to do with it. So I can just be like the proudest parent in the world because I literally had nothing to do with how beautiful this film is.